Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. One Borderland nonprofit is working to create a fair and sustainable food system through education and empowerment. Here to share more about the mission of La Semilla Food Center is Krysten Aguilar, co-executive director of the organization. Krysten, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start off first with a congratulations on the new grant that you all have received at La Semilla from the Ford Foundation and the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture to work on a new project that aims to change narratives about the U.S.-Mexico border. Can you share a little bit about this grant and opportunity that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. We were thrilled to get it. All of our work, we work through so many different programs. We have 5 separate programs, and kind of a theme throughout all of them is really reimagining what our food system and farming system here in our region can look like. And so with this grant, we're really able to take that to a whole other level. And it's really rooted in storytelling and the storytelling traditions of our culture and our communities and our regions. And we're really focused on just making those stories come to the forefront, right? To bring power to our communities and resources and really connect so many different people who are doing brilliant and amazing things throughout the region and support them as well, so that we have this kind of spider web or collective of folks who are doing really important work through the food farm system, through arts, through cooking, farming, and really pull together all of these different pieces to create this whole collective of folks working to really uplift our communities.
So how do you think this project and the way you all envision it can help change the narrative about the U.S.-Mexico border?
Right. So I think a lot of times in many communities that are Black, Indigenous, or Brown communities, or border communities, or poor communities, low-income communities, the narrative that emerges is one of deficit, right? Like, this is what these communities are lacking. This is what they are doing wrong. When in reality, we know that our communities are incredibly vibrant and diverse and powerful. And then we have these situations that are set up because of extractive policies and all of these other systems that work explicitly to extract from BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities. And so we end up with this system, especially in our farming system or our food system, that isn't equitable for communities of color often, right? And so then we hear this narrative of how these communities along the border are lacking something or they're not doing enough. And we know, in fact, the opposite is true. And so we really think that if we use things like this grant and this project, and we're trying to build this out even more, right, is we're really focusing on uplifting the stories that our communities are telling and bringing them to the forefront, and to normalize those stories and make those the dominant narrative of how our stories are being told. One of the ways we're doing this is through, first we have to gather the stories. And so we're doing this through several listening sessions. Of course, because of COVID, they had to be virtual this last year, but our communities are rooted in stories. And, like our elders, our communities have these rich stories. And so how do we gather those in a really respectful way that's not extractive and bring those to the forefront? We have several projects lined up to do just that.
Okay, now you mentioned, the agricultural system, the food supply, they're not equitable for everyone involved, border communities as well. What do you mean by that? Can you further elaborate on why you think it is that way?
Sure. So we know that one of the projects as part of this storytelling project is this fantastic graphic zine. We're working with Zeke Pena, who's an artist in El Paso. And he has created this beautiful, it's 40-page spread, graphic novel essentially on the history of the Farm Bill as it relates specifically to our region. So to really understand why our food and farm system is so inequitable, you have to look back at history. Like, how did we get to where we are? And a lot of times that story is just not known. It's not told. And it's told in a very particular way, as history often is, right? And so whenever we're looking at the history of who has land, why do they have it, who doesn't have land, how come they don't have it, right? We're looking at a system that was built on, for example, theft of land from indigenous tribes, or stolen labor from enslaved Africans brought over. And so you have this wealth that was being built for generations on stolen land and stolen labor. And so now we're at this point where, Black communities have lost land at an astounding rate over the past 100 years. There have been really inequitable policies at the USDA, for example, where they weren't lending money to Black and brown farmers or guaranteeing loans or doing other things, but they were for white farmers, for example. Homesteading acts didn't let brown or Black people own land or get it for free, but it did for white folks. So how do we're now at this point where we are in the system that was built on inequity, but going forward, how can we start changing that and flipping that narrative, flipping that script to not only start telling the story, but to start bringing equity back into it? I think a lot of folks know that, farm workers a lot of times are immigrants who are coming over and feeding our entire food system. And oftentimes they can't afford to feed their own families. And I think most of us know deep down, right, like this isn't quite right. There's something wrong when that's happening. And so how do we start shifting that? And the way to do that is to start really focusing on equitable policy and getting resources back into our communities from private or governmental sources. And the way to do that is to tell the story and tell it in a compelling way that starts making people have a shift in their thinking. And so we really think that focusing on the stories is a way to really start changing the narrative and redirecting resources.
So how do you tell a story or capture a story and then produce it and tell it and make a difference without, further marginalizing communities or perhaps expanding the political divide that we have in our country?
Sure. Yeah, I think it comes down to telling a story that is rooted in our humanity, right? Because what I found is that regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum, or for the most part, that everybody wants to be able to raise their family in their community in a safe, supported, vibrant way, right? And I think once we're able to tell a story with compassion and with openness, so that we're all starting from this same understanding of like, okay, well, here's where we are now, here's how we got here, and here's this amazing way to move forward that doesn't necessarily exclude people, but that's bringing other people who have been excluded in, right? And so how do we keep moving forward in that way? And I think it's in order to tell those compelling stories, you have to start thinking beyond just an article or the written word. And so what we're doing with the storytelling project is really to start looking at, okay, how else do our communities communicate? How else can we communicate to a broader audience in a way that's compelling and moves them to action? And one of those ways, we have a few murals that are being painted, for example, that capture the stories that our communities have been telling. We have videos, we have the Farm Bill zine, and we're also starting a fellowship program that is really focused on directing resources to the folks in our community who are doing the work, right, day to day, to start shifting narratives and to start creating actual change in the community.
Okay, it sounds like you have a lot with this project. I want to talk about an issue you brought up, and that had to do with farm workers, the injustices that you say they face. Can you kind of give us an understanding of that? I know some in our community may be familiar because we have had a history of farm workers, braceros, in our area, in our region. that go back decades. And so I'd like to hear from you, what are some of the issues and challenges that farm workers in our country today are facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So most people might not know that farm workers aren't afforded a lot of the protections that any other worker is afforded. Things like minimum wage laws don't apply to them, workers' comp or insurance, paid time, right? Like all of these things that are focused on supporting our farm workers, they don't have those protections that most workers in our country have. And historically, right, the reason for that is because it was an agricultural system that was built on exploitation, right? And so we kind of changed it a little bit and tried to figure out, well, how can we keep doing this? But the point is we can't keep doing this. It's not sustainable long term. How are we going to feed our community if part of our community can't feed themselves because they aren't getting paid enough to pick food, right? And so there's no easy answer to this. There is a big shift that has to happen, and it won't be smooth or easy, and it will be a little painful, right? Because they're also farmers who have to make a living for their families. And how do we make that shift from paying our farmers what their food is worth, so that they can pay their workers what their work is worth, and still make sure that our families who are living in poverty are able to afford food? It's a very complex situation because we have a system that has been set up for generations that serves to create money and wealth for a very select few, but doesn't necessarily work in a very comprehensive way for the long term. Couple that with huge droughts that we're in right now, right? Like as our region, our country, and figuring out, well, what does that mean for our farming community long term? How are we going to keep farming on this land for the next 100 years? So there are big shifts that have to happen. There are no easy answers, but there are some answers, and there are ways forward to do that. Our food system is highly subsidized.
Yeah.
Some of our conventional food system is highly subsidized for commodity crops, but not for fruits and vegetables. And so if we're asking our small farmers or our farmers who are feeding our communities to compete with highly subsidized food systems, that's not quite fair either. So we have to start putting all these different puzzle pieces together to really start making any change.
Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has put a lot of attention on essential workers and folks who work in agriculture and the food industry, as well as the whole setup of the food system that we have. Do you think that this is an opportunity to really address this issue now that so much attention has been paid to farm workers and folks who are called essential workers in this industry? And if so, what can be done, do you think, to where all sides can find some sort of agreement? Right.
So I think that a lot of us working in the food and farm system and organizing groups have always known, right, that there are these inequities, and the folks who are feeding us were getting left out of a lot of conversations. And like you said, COVID really brought to light all of these inequities. And so there are ways to move forward, and it is, enacting a livable wage for all people. It is ensuring that subsidies for our farm systems are going to the fruits and vegetables and other foods that are feeding our families, and not just commodity crops. It's making sure that we're supporting our small farmers and mid-sized farmers as they're growing and trying to scale and feed our communities, and supporting agricultural workers so that they can make a living wage and have the basic protections afforded to most other workers. It's some people, I think, will always be unhappy with changing things going forward because change is very hard. I think it's human nature to be a little bit nervous. But I also know that farmers are resilient, and some of the people, who care most for our environment, because they have to figure out how to keep growing food, growing forward. They're really connected to, there's this really big shift towards regenerative agriculture and really making sure, well, what does that mean for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years? How can the soil keep feeding our communities? And so it's going to take a lot of policy change. It's going to take a lot of support for folks who, up until now, I think have been considered somewhat expendable, right? Like a lot of our food workers, it's like, well, that's not skilled labor, when in fact it's essential labor, not just skilled. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to have to come together. And I do have, most of the time, have some hope that we're going to be able to move in that direction.
With this issue, I mean, do you know of any states or research that's being done that may be showing some possible solutions to addressing a more equitable system with this?
Absolutely. So we know that at the national level, and in New Mexico, Senator Benray Lujan has signed on and supported, and several others in the federal delegation have supported, the justice and equity in a lot of food and farming policy that's happening. So to study the Justice for Black Farmers Act, for example, which really looks at the land loss and the stolen labor and all of these other things that have impacted the Black community specifically, for example. So there are a lot of policy shifts happening so that we can start remedying all of the inequities that currently exist. And in addition to that, there's a lot of folks that are really focused on doing farm workers' rights, ensuring that workers' comp covers them, that they are included in minimum wage conversations. That conversation has happened here in New Mexico and didn't quite get passed, but it's a conversation that's been happening and is building momentum as well.
Now, I know you mentioned the work you're doing with the grant to get some education out there and awareness, but I'd also like to talk with you more about the educational efforts that La Semilla is involved with our border communities. Can you share with us what you have planned for this year?
Sure. One of our new very exciting things that's about to be launched is our Farmer Fellowship Program, which is essentially a beginning farmer training program based in agroecological practices, right? So we're going to be posting this soon if everybody wants to keep an eye out on our social media for that. And we're going to be looking for beginning farmers or folks who want to be beginning farmers or who maybe have a farm already. And we're really looking at hands-on practices of farming in our region. And it's going to happen at our farm, but we'll also place folks at different partner farmers throughout the region in El Paso and in Doña Ana County to really get a full understanding of how to grow food, how to do it in a regenerative way, focusing on compost or desert foods, growing fruits and vegetables in our region, mushroom production. Really covers a wide gamut. And we'll be focusing on production techniques and then also the movement piece of agroecology. So what is our food system and how are we moving this way forward so that we're able to feed ourselves for the long term? So that's a really exciting part of this larger fellowship program that we're going to be launching in the coming year. So beyond farmers, we'll be working with chefs or artists or other folks in the food and farm system to support the work that they're doing.
Are there any requirements for this fellowship?
We're really focused on, young farmers, beginning farmers, and you have to be in the region. There is going to be an application process where you answer some pretty simple questions, and we hope that we have a lot of folks applying for this. It's the first time we've done it. It'll be a pilot year basically to see how it rolls out, but there will be an application process. There will be a stipend provided for the training over the program.
Now, I know La Semilla has been involved with some edible education as well to communities, and you also have a community farm. How have you all been adapting during this pandemic and still being able to reach the communities when you may not be able to meet face to face?
Yeah, it's been rough. A lot of our programming is so rooted in relationship building and that face-to-face interaction from, like you said, our edible ed programs in the schools, in the school gardens, directly with teachers, our community education programs, working with elders in our communities and having, a lot of hands-on cooking and gardening exercises and experiences. We've had to shift to virtual education opportunities, as a lot of people have done, from those programs to our food safety for small farmers programs. And it's really difficult. We've had to be pretty um, intentional about maintaining relationships during this time because it's been an isolating time for a lot of people. And um, another issue, that our region has is lack of internet access in a lot of rural areas where we work. And so a lot of our program staff have spent a lot of time on the phone or texting with folks, like really making that one-on-one connection to make sure that we can get, food boxes to folks' houses, and that we can get the garden kits and different things directly to them and checking in with them. So it's been a little intense and a little, weird thing to think about how we keep moving forward, but it's also interesting because now we have this whole, collection of new tools that we have developed that are all virtual. So we'll be able going forward to hopefully at some point continue doing in-person work, but also leave the door open for more virtual work so that we can spread all of that education even further than we were able to before.
How has your community farm been doing during this pandemic as well, and its mission? Have you had to adapt anything with that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we had to cut back on volunteer hours and having folks out at the farm. And as a community farm, if you take the community out of it, right, then it's not the same. But we've been really specific in following a lot of really COVID safe protocols to ensure the safety of all of our folks who are working on the farm. And we've been in production the entire time. Still, we have had to really focus on, for example, we were still selling to the schools and able to aggregate produce from several of our small partner farmers as well. But we would put educational pamphlets or flyers in the boxes that were going out, notifying people that certain things hadn't been washed because the wash and pack didn't allow for enough people to be in there in close proximity to wash it and do so in a safe way. So we were able to really get some education out too whenever we were still selling to schools, and we shifted to home delivery service for a lot of folks also throughout the region. So we've been in production the whole time, and we've been making sure that we have markets open for a lot of our small farmers who depend on those markets and that income source.
Now, La Semilla is also involved in different policy issues. Can you share with us what were some of the policy initiatives that you had for this year and that you're currently working on?
Sure. Our main policy focus currently is the Healthy Food Financing Initiative that we worked on at the state level with Senator Carrie Hamblin and Representative Angelica Rubio. This is a fantastic initiative that is really focused on increasing economic development and entrepreneurs and small businesses throughout New Mexico through forgivable loans, grants, and funding as these capital deployment vehicles to really bolster and support our food and farm system. So from small farmers to farmers markets or farm stands, retail outlets, really looking at creating a funding pool that will be able to support our entire food value chain. And we've been working with several partners from across the state to do this. We had broad bipartisan support for the policy from 2 Senate committees, the Senate floor, 1 House committee, and unfortunately we just ran out of time and it was never heard on the House floor, which happened to a little over half, I think, of the bills that were introduced this year. But we had broad support from across the entire political spectrum for this policy that was really going to create a fund to pull in outside dollars as well, right, from private funds, federal grants, up to about $5 million, right, to be able to pull in from outside sources with a really small appropriation from the state. We did get $100,000 directed to economic development to support this process. So outside of the policy world, we're going to continue to work with our partners, Community Development Finance Institute over the next year or two to really start establishing this fund, to get it up and running so that we can really support all the infrastructure needs, production needs, retail needs throughout our state to get our healthy local foods into all of our communities.
Okay, we just have about a couple of minutes left, but I'd like to hear from you. You know, a year ago, we were really dealing with this pandemic as our economy shut down. Also, there was a run on grocery stores. We saw how quick a food shortage could happen in our area. Can you kind of share with us what you saw when this was happening and what we should pay attention to when it comes to our food system.
Absolutely. It was, I think everybody had a moment of, oh my God, because I know I've never had something, I think in my lifetime, right, like that happen. So it was a little bit shocking. One thing that we noticed from ourselves and from several of our partners was that demand for local food and the local food boxes, CSAs from across the state and different places shot way up. And the big issue and barrier to feeding our communities is that our farmers are not able to produce enough to get that to our communities, right? Because the way it's currently set up, most of the food that's grown in New Mexico is exported, right? And then we buy food back from outside of the state. And so one of the big issues is lack of production support for fruits and vegetables in New Mexico and lack of infrastructure for transportation, washing and packing, aggregation, which we knew were issues before, but it really came into focus through COVID. But so many small farmers stepped up, so many food hubs and CSAs really stepped up to start getting that food into our communities. And I think we're starting to lay the ground for really ramping that up over the coming years.
Okay, Krysten Aguilar is Co-Executive Director of La Semilla Food Center. I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And as always, we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.